Hey, welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I want to bring in my guest, Joseph Scott Morgan, death investigator and forensic expert extraordinaire. And Joseph, before I get to you, we want to go back in the courtroom and find out exactly what's going on. Now, remember, Shawn Grate was convicted of 2 counts of murder. This is the death penalty phase. The jury that convicted him last week will decide should he have life in prison or receive the death penalty. Let's get back in the courtroom live. Well, it looks like they're still sorting things out there in the courtroom. But Joseph, I want to talk to you really quick here while we have time. I watched a very disturbing video that Shawn Grate did when he was actually showing investigators how he strangled his victims. Now, I've worked a lot of crime scenes, but I'm not the forensic guy. I'm not the death investigator. So walk our viewers and our listeners through what those victims actually went through when Shawn Grate did this.
Sure, Vincent. First off, it's great to be with you and great to be with my friends at Law and Crime today. In Grate's cases, I'd say case, but as we well know, it's cases. He shows kind of a connection between his methodology or modality of death, and one of the things that we find consistent through all of these is strangulation. This is not, for the viewers at home, this is not an impersonal event. This is something that is very up close and personal. In many cases, the victims would literally be able to at least see into his eyes, be able to feel his breath in their presence, and also feel his hands upon their body. And in these cases of strangulation, most of the time, these are very personal events. There's a lot of rage associated with them. You have these events where these serialized killers like this will gain great pleasure out of the control over whether or not someone is going to live or die. This is not something that is kind of detached like a shooting, for instance. So the mechanism itself and some of the things that we look for, and I think that this is really important relative to the death, is if the folks at home will feel the center area of cartilage in the center of their throat, commonly what we refer to as the Adam's apple right here, and the area below that, this is the external area of our trachea, or in common terms, the windpipe. And then alongside in the soft area, we have what are referred to as the strap muscles that kind of run diagonal through here. At autopsy, you've heard kind of the testimony here. They're looking, they made this diagnosis of strangulation. And one of the things that they're looking for are focal areas of hemorrhage in here. And this indicates that someone has clamped down on the throat and squeezed to the point where they're causing hemorrhage in the soft tissue and where the trachea is actually being crushed to occlude the airway so that no air. And for any of us that have ever had the air shut off when we're horsing around as kids or whatever, you know what a horrifying experience this is. Imagine that you're sensing, and you're the victim, that life is slowly slipping away from you. And I feel as though that at this point, now that we're in sentencing phase, the prosecution has done an effective job of portraying this. And I would think at least that this is going to resonate strongly with the jury when it comes time for them to make their decision relative to what sentence they're going to apply in Grate's case.
Yeah, Joseph, you touched on something. You said slowly slipping away. You could feel the life slowly slipping away. So how long does this actually take? Give our listeners and our viewers an idea, because a lot of people watch TV and they assume that you're choked out within 15 seconds and you're dead. You see it on the movies all the time, but it's not quite like that, is it?
No, it's not. And let me throw in one other scenario here. and in working several series of serial homicides over the course of my career in New Orleans and in Atlanta with the coroner and the medical examiner, respectively. One of the things that these guys like to do, whether they're using manual strangulation or ligature, you'll see kind of a tightening and a loosening and a retightening, if you will, of these individuals, so that you will see multiple areas of hemorrhage, maybe that they're realigning their hand. And what this gives us an indication of is that this kind of idea of slowly killing them, they are bringing the person to the point of death, all right? Kind of wrap your mind around this. Bringing the person to that point of death, then releasing the grip or ligature, allowing them to breathe again. Keep in mind, the horror, the terror is still there, the fear is indwelling, adrenaline's pumping, and then they tighten it down again. And this literally is a transference of this idea of this ultimate power. It's what's referred to as an asymmetrical relationship, where you've got an individual that is in a dominant position over these individuals, and the victim is totally at their mercy. So it doesn't, in one sense, you could be dead within a minute or two, but if the individual who is exercising ultimate control over whether or not you're going to live or not continues to release, apply again, release, apply again, could drag this out indefinitely. So in the immediate, let's just think of it, if it was just a straight kind of strangulation where he just grabs them, chokes them out, death would come probably in about a minute, okay? But he could do this over a course of time where he could get the maximum satisfaction in his mind out of this event.
Yeah, it's definitely not something quick and from far away like a shooting, which, I've worked tons on the streets of Nashville. This is a very up close and personal type call. I want to shoot it over to the 911 call. This is what sparked this entire thing back in September 13th of 2016, who we've come to know as Jane Doe called 911, and it started with, "I've been kidnapped." Take a listen. Hey, welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. You just heard that 911 call back from September of 2016. Jane Doe called and she said she had been abducted. And you could hear at the very end of that call, first responders responding to that call. I've been on the other side of that call as former law enforcement myself. And police never know what they're going to find inside that home. As we know now, police found not only Jane Doe, but they found two deceased individuals inside that home, as well as Shawn Grate, who again is waiting to find out if he will receive life in prison or the death penalty. We're actually going to hear previous testimony from Lisa Riley. She was the hospital staff that actually treated Jane Doe for her injuries when she was found. Take a listen. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. You just heard the very graphic testimony of Lisa Riley. She was the hospital attendant who actually examined Jane Doe on the night she was actually rescued from the grasp of Shawn Grate, who is waiting right now in the courtroom as we speak to decide whether he will spend the rest of his life in prison or if he will receive the death penalty. We're going to take a quick break. I know the jury is entering the courtroom at this time. We're going to take a quick break and see if we can get you back live in the courtroom right after this break. Stay tuned. Hey, welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. The jury is still deciding what they're going to do in the courtroom. But while we're waiting on that, I want to bring back on Joseph Scott Morgan. And, Joseph, there's an old saying, and it rings true to me. You never forget the very first time you smell a deceased, dead body. And to this day, I can remember the very first time I walked into a crime scene and I literally smelled the smell of death and the smell of blood. So I know this was in September of 2016. It's Ohio. It's not some place that's very hot throughout the year. but it also wasn't wintertime, so I would assume that there was some type of smell of decay inside that home. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, there would have been. And when investigators first arrived, probably when the police officers made first entry into the home, they would have gotten an indication of this. Let's remember there were two remains that were discovered. One was in a bit more of an advanced state, and I believe that we had the second victim that was found in the closet, if I remember correctly, or immediately adjacent there, and had been down for about a week. And it does get significantly warm in that location. I've actually taught coroners in the state of Ohio many years ago, and so it gets it's significant enough so that you would have had decompositional changes going on in that home. And I think this goes to a bigger issue. You had Grate, who was actually still indwelling the structure with these two victims inside of the home and living in there. And not only that, he was bringing another person there, and I remember when we first started covering this, one of the more shocking things that came out, he told, I believe, Jane Doe that he was not going to do harm to her. I think trying to, I don't know, calm her down or whatever it was to get her to relax in that environment. She would have smelled this as well. And that adds a level of terror to this. Again, it all goes back part and parcel. We have the physical evidence. And though I'm not a forensic psychologist, you can imagine what this kind of imprints in this person's mind as they're, am I going to make it out of here? There's this foul odor hanging in the air. I've got this guy that's menacing. He was very charming at first, I'm sure, and then he just kind of exploded. If I remember correctly, Vincent, I think that there was a statement that Grate had alluded to, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think he had mentioned taking care of these individuals that were in the home. And this goes to this idea of he was taking care of the victims, these poor violated victims that were in the home. And the fact that Jane Doe was not killed is quite amazing to me. This is certainly the exception, as opposed to the norm, where you have someone that escapes the clutches of one of these individuals, where they're in the throes of doing great harm, as was just illustrated in that graphic testimony of what he had done to her. I thought that you could tell that the nurse was very nervous on the stand, and rightfully so. She's there in the courtroom describing what this person had endured and what she witnessed firsthand, and she's in tune to this. She heard the cries of this woman, I'm sure, as she was doing the examination on her, and saw the physical evidence. And this paints a gruesome picture.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I wonder, because in our profession, we know what the smell of death is. I wonder if Jane Doe, although she smelled obviously something, I wonder if she knew what that was. And I wonder more if she actually came across those two dead bodies inside that home. That would be something that you could never, ever get out of your mind. But I guess, we don't know at this point, and I don't know if we will ever know that.
Right. Yeah. No, I don't know that we necessarily will. I will tell you that because of the smell and the way we're kind of set up as humans, it would have given an individual pause to know that something was not right. Just like with any organic that's decomposing in an environment, we find it repugnant naturally, and it puts an individual off. I think that she was aware that something was foul in the house. Now, whether or not she was able to visualize those bodies or ascertain that they were human bodies, I don't know. But still, this odor leached through in the air. And keep in mind, and it's very important that people at home understand this, and I hope that the jury understands this, Grate was indwelling this environment, and he was living. Mm-hmm. And to really drive this point home, he was aware. He was fully aware of what the origin of the smell was. So that that does give you pause to, it kind of sends a chill up your spine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you touched on something quite key here. It's not often that these victims get a chance to escape. Mm-hmm. It reminds me of something back in 1991, and the person I actually came across when I was a police cadet in the city of Milwaukee, and his name was Jeffrey Dahmer. If you remember, one of his victims actually escaped. Unfortunately, the police sent him back to the home with Dahmer, and he was later killed. But it's not too often that these victims get a chance to escape. And with that, I want you, our viewers and our listeners on Sirius XM Radio, to listen to testimony from the officer that actually found those two deceased bodies inside that home. Take a listen. Hey, welcome back to the Law&Crime Network and Law&Crime on Sirius XM Radio. You're actually listening to the defense closing arguments in the Shawn Grate case. Shawn Grate was convicted of 2 counts of murder, kidnapping, rape, burglary, just a plethora of charges in the state of Ohio. The jury right now is hearing closing arguments to decide if Shawn Grate should receive the death penalty or life in prison. We're going to take a quick break and get right back into the courtroom. Hey, welcome back to the Law&Crime Network and Law&Crime on SiriusXMRadio.com. Again, we're covering the sentencing phase of the Shawn Grate case in Ohio. Remember, he was convicted of 2 counts of murder, rape, burglary, and a bunch of other charges. The defense right now is in the courtroom. Let's go in the courtroom.
The ladies go.
Hey, welcome back to the Law&Crime Network and Law&Crime on Sirius XM Radio. You just heard the prosecution rebuttal to the defense closing arguments in the sentencing phase of Shawn Grate. The jury will decide should he serve life in prison or receive the death penalty. Shawn Grate was convicted in the state of Ohio, 2 counts of murder, rape, kidnapping, and a bunch of other charges. Right now, the judge is actually instructing the jury. I believe they will go back to deliberate here shortly. While they do that, we're going to take a short break, and we will see you on the other side. Stay tuned. Hey, welcome back to Law&Crime Network and Law&Crime on Sirius XM Radio. Still with me, Joseph Scott Morgan, death investigator, forensic extraordinaire. Joseph, we heard testimony earlier from Ed Staley, who actually found the bodies. And I understand when Shawn actually was arrested, he actually confessed to up to 5 murders. Now, I know police were led to other bodies. I don't believe those came up in this trial, but what would be some of the evidence as a death investigator that we would look for to tie these bodies to Shawn Grate?
Well, Vincent, I got to tell you, depending upon how long these other bodies have been down, it would soft tissue damage is generally what we're looking for in cases of manual strangulation, and that sounds like that's his modus operandi. Mm-hmm. And so, over a period of time, after decomposition takes place, those muscles that I mentioned in our earlier block in the neck, all of that is essentially going to be gone, unless in some way the body was in a particularly dry area where it was mummified. I doubt that very seriously. There won't be much evidence there. There is evidence sometimes where we can see a fracturing of some of the cervical spinal bodies, but again, that takes a tremendous amount of force. Much more force than would be applied, say, for instance, than just strictly, choke holding somebody out to the point where they're deceased. So I think that that goes to the idea of, well, connectivity could also come down to how exactly did he dispose of the bodies? Was there a specific mode that he employed? Were there any specific items that he left behind? Remember, this is a learned behavior. These people start off in kind of the bush leagues, if you will, of serial killing, and then they kind of ramp up as they begin to learn. That's something you hear in the media quite often, but there is an element of truth to that. And once they kind of get in their lane with that, they tend to stay in that lane. So it's the cumulative evidence over a period of time that kind of bears these things out.
Got it. And you touched on the soft tissue and how that evidence would, depending on how long the bodies had been there, kind of go away. But what about DNA evidence? Because I've said time and time again, look, admission of guilt is not proof of guilt, right? He could say,
Right.
yes, I've killed these other individuals. But what about DNA evidence that, you know, we've seen in the previous case that we worked on here on the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM, the Jeffrey Willis case, where, you know, he was charged with other murders based on evidence found after his arrest. So could there possibly be DNA that could tie Shawn Grate to these other individuals?
Well, that would depend on the nature, wouldn't it, relative to the scenes in which these initial events took place. I think placing Shawn Grate's DNA and the victim's DNA together in close proximity can create a compelling case. However, if you're talking about somebody that is a non-cocooned burial, for instance, where they're just kind of left in a dirt grave, a bare dirt grave, they're not protected by anything, that's going to be a tougher road to hoe, as they say.
Right.
Now, in their particular areas, if that where they existed, if Grate went in there and that area has been protected in some way, that might be possible.
Yeah, and you mentioned non-cocoon, so I assume you mean they're not covered by any type of shelter or cover or something like that. And of course, the elements would, of course, play into that as well,
Right.
you know, to possibly wash away DNA evidence. While the judge is still giving out the instructions, I want to take us back to the investigator who found the bodies and listen to more of his testimony. Take a listen. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. We've been listening to the investigator that recovered the bodies found in the home or where Shawn Grate was arrested. Shawn Grate is convicted of 2 counts of murder in the state of Ohio. Right now, the judge is giving jury instructions to that jury to decide whether he should receive the death penalty or life in prison. I want to bring back on Joseph Scott Morgan. And in listening to that investigator, he mentioned a word that I'm not too familiar with, and I'm sure our listeners and our viewers may not be as well. He mentioned, and correct me on the pronunciation of this, pape or pupe. What exactly is that?
Yes, the pupa stage. And what he's talking about here, Vincent, is the life cycle of the fly. And one of the things that we work in death investigation is this idea of postmortem interval, exactly how long it has been since that point of death, when death occurred, to the point in which the body is found. And that kind of gives us the ability to tie things back. You think about things like rigor mortis, livor mortis, algor mortis, gastric contents. Well, decompositional process also includes external factors like insect development, and primarily common housefly. The common housefly, their life cycle literally is about 26 hours, 26 to 27 hours, okay? So it's a marker that we can use in time. So let's just envision it this way. Envision fly comes in, lays an egg, okay? The egg develops into a larva. Mm-hmm. You go through the maggot stage, and then eventually what is kind of happening all the way around this life cycle is you make it through the pupa, the thing hatches out, comes out of the husk, think caterpillar, and comes a brand new fly. And then the cycle repeats itself. Those flies soon become adult flies. They go back in and lay eggs. And one of the things that's really fascinating that entomologists do is that they can tell you how many generations of flies there have been at a scene. And we rely upon this, at least to a certain degree, to kind of gauge how long the person has been down. Mm-hmm. And the investigator sounds like he was well-versed. He knew what he was talking about.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure that he collected sufficient samples or the evidence tech there, and they probably referred this out to forensic entomologists to kind of narrow that time down.
Right, and you made a good point. I think his investigation was spot on. You know what's really sad about this, Joseph, is it appears that the victim he was talking about was hogtied because he mentioned bruises around the ankles, her wrists were bound. So I can only imagine what she went through during this whole ordeal. I know you have to sign off here really soon, but I wanted to ask you. He actually stated that anything could be used as a literature. Talk about the amount of pressure it actually takes to strangle someone with an object.
Well, of course, that's going to depend upon the object. And yes, he's correct. Just about any type of item, flexible item can be used as a ligature. We think about things like belts,
Right.
nylon rope,
Shoestring.
shoestrings.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's electrical cord. I've seen just about every mode like that. And keep in mind, the wider the ligature, let's say a wide leather belt, it's going to require a bit more force. When
Right.
you begin to narrow that surface area, and it creates a deeper furrow. So it takes less force to facilitate the strangulation of air at that point, to literally cut the air off from the victim so that they die of anoxia.
Got it. Joseph Scott Morgan, I appreciate you joining us, my friend, and we will see you next time here on the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. We're going to take a short break and get right back into the courtroom. Stay tuned.